In this one, we're going to go over techniques to create a little bit of independence in your voices, and then when you go to actually put this into music, what's like orchestrated and whatnot, you can pick and choose what's going to take certain lines. And we're going to actually go back and use kind of like the SATB kind of thinking. However, we're going to break away a little bit and use a little trick from, I learned this from Tchaikovsky of all people, from his theory book. And I get asked this question quite often about the independence of parts and whatnot, that I often always do. I like the sound of just the independent parts and the contrapuntal movement that goes along with this. So in Tchaikovsky's book, he talks about free voice leading and how basically just how it's impractical to think about open and closed position in actual music creation. He does see it as impractical, and this is why I like reading theory books from composers over theorists, because someone like Tchaikovsky is going to openly admit that he doesn't actually find much use for the set rules of basic SATB. Instead calls it free voice leading. The technique he uses, well, I actually take this a little further and actually break a lot of rules that Tchaikovsky wouldn't even break. So everybody's probably heard this. We don't want to sound like Baroque music, but I want to point something out, that sometimes it's just an illusion. There's an F chord being outlined while another's doing a run. And oftentimes, contrapuntal music is very much an illusion. But we don't want to, again, sound like a chorale. I can think of this because I have this memorized. Bach chorale. However, we want to keep that kind of independent sound of each of the four voices and convert it to something that might sound very film score-ish. So we're going to use melodic minor and the ascending chords only. And I have a course on this right below. It's completely free. You could find it at this site. And I took this melody first and harmonized it with just a simple one chord. Well, let me play through it. I harmonized it with the ascending melodic minor chords going downwards. So again, I have a course on this if you don't understand these things. You'll find interesting pivots in music, especially the better you get it. That G chord is a pivot to D minor melodic minor. So I just repeated the statement in D melodic minor. So that's the melody, and I simply just harmonized it with four voices, okay? Or three voices. This is the fourth voice, the melody. And you can tell it does not sound like a Bach chorale now, so it does not sound like Baroque music. Playing through it very slow. I'll stop there, okay, when it transitions to D minor. I want to point something out. What we usually call the tenor, then the alto actually are a continuous rising line that contrasts with the melody. So the cello groups contrast with the melody, or just kind of interplay with the melody to sound like two separate lines. Already we have some independence here. On the diminished chord, I want to point this out too, that sometimes you could use unprepared suspensions, like on the A diminished. The melody does that. And in this case, I've treated the melody just as one of the four voices in that free-form kind of Tchaikovsky thinking. Now, but unprepared suspension, that D becomes, and the A diminished. And a good thing, when a melody comes to rest, that's a good time for other movements, so that's what happened there. I want to point out something else here, too. I'm not concerned about that parallelism that happens there. Okay? It interfered with what I wanted to portray. Another thing, in these passing tones, in the thirds, you have this skip over tone that you'd normally just find in pentatonic scales. We're allowing for that, which is something they would not do in a chorale. So we're using the freeform kind of Tchaikovsky thinking with more freeform modern things, the unprepared suspension, and then these skip over tone. Because in the old school rules, you'd have to skip and step up. We're not doing that because we're allowing for more freedom of voice movement. So when it transitions to D minor, we have the same exact harmonic scheme and melody. Except after the diminished chord, the bass completely drops out of the scheme. Still remaining with 4 voices, but it's doing the free voice leading like Tchaikovsky talked about. We're not worried about open and close. Again, we have this walk-up line too, in contrast to the melody, given independence. Really hard to portray just on keyboards and with 4 voices here how it would be orchestrated, but on the A chord, we have this happen. But for instance, I had the cello line just kind of outline chord tones of each chord. So we had this wind kind of take over when everything came to rest from string groups mostly. Skip over a note again. But it's just an A minor and an E minor, and it's A mixolydian at that point. Skip over tone. In thirds, like you do in pentatonic music, which again isn't allowed in the old rule set of SATB. Again, this is A mixolydian, just the 1 and the 5 chord of mixolydian. So again, going back to our Bach example, you could use chord tones just to kind of portray motion. Okay, one's doing just chord tones. So that's what I was doing here with the cello line. And then the winds take over and do something like this. Just much simpler. So there's really 2 lessons in this, kind of a free form kind of SATB style writing with your melody, and looking at melodic minor using the ascending chords only. And then it does switch to a different mode at that point. The other thing to note is once you have the sketch, you could assign any part of this thing you wrote out to any group, so where it sounds like a continuous contrast to like the melody. Even though in the 4 voice version it switches voices. It didn't in the mock-up. This is actually a very in-depth kind of topic, and I can't really teach you how to expand this out to orchestra parts. That's just something you're just going to have to experiment with and literally practice, because it does take quite a bit of practice to make it sound fluent and smooth. But you'll actually start to hear the parts when you're writing out little sketches like this once you get used to doing stuff like this. So the aim, again, here is not to sound like a Bach chorale or Baroque music or classical music, but taking Tchaikovsky's advice and thinking more in terms of free voice leading, not worried about all those rules of spacing and all that, and taking it a step further and have stuff like unprepared suspensions, moves that are not normally considered moves in those old school rules, like skip over tones, like you'd find in pentatonic scales. They didn't do stuff like that. That's why a lot of the times you may be trying too hard to follow the old school rules. In another video, I'll show you the same kind of process, but we'll treat the melody separate and also treat non-harmonic tones when they occur at the same time. In the old rules, if you've ever studied SATB, they have to be consonant with each other. Well, and if you start thinking a little bit more freeform, you could realize they don't have to be consonant with each other. And also how your rhythmic placement will play a big role. You might stick the non-harmonic tones more on stronger beats, for instance. In summary, you still are thinking about that independence of horizontal movement, but with a much freer kind of thinking. Not worried about spacing and all that and unprepared things and such.